So there's this word that floats around a lot, especially in philosophy, politics, and history: dialectic. It sounds super important, right? But if you try to nail down exactly what it means, well, it can get a little slippery. So let's unpack it. Because right off the bat, you find some pretty intense takes on it. I mean, look at this one. It's not describing a search for truth, but a method for manipulation. So, which is it? And that's really the big question we're tackling here. Is the dialectic this noble, classical idea, a path to truth through honest debate? Or is it something a lot more calculated, a tool to actually create conflict, just to push a specific outcome? To get to the bottom of this, we've got to go back, way back, to where the whole idea started. See, originally, the concept was actually pretty simple. The classical definition of a dialectic is basically just a good faith, structured argument. The point isn't to win. The point is for everyone to use logic and reason to figure out what's actually true. And that makes total sense when you look at the word's roots. It comes straight from the ancient Greek dialegeste, which literally just means to converse with. It's where we get our word dialogue. It was all about the art of the conversation. But this wasn't just about friendly chats over coffee. The people who really forged this into a powerful philosophical tool were the ancient Greeks, and one name, in particular, stands out: Socrates. And right here, we see the first big fork in the road. You've got Socrates on one side, using dialectic to hunt for absolute truth, with a capital T, all through pure reason. But on the other side, you had the sophists. They taught rhetoric, the art of winning an argument, usually by appealing to emotion and influence. For them, the truth didn't matter as much as victory. And there's a perfect example of how Socrates did this. In one of Plato's dialogues, he bumps into a guy named Euthyphro and asks him to define piety. Euthyphro pretty confidently says, "Oh, it's what the gods love." Simple, right? But then Socrates, through a series of brilliant questions, gets him to admit that the gods are always fighting and disagreeing. So a single action could be loved by one god and hated by another, making it both pious and impious at the same time. Boom, a contradiction. The dialectic didn't give him the answer, but it completely dismantled his flawed one, forcing him to think on a much deeper level. Okay, so how did we get from a way to have a smarter conversation to a theory for how all of reality works? Well, for that, we need to jump forward about 2,000 years to a German philosopher who saw the dialectic as the very engine of history itself: George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel took this idea and just scaled it up infinitely. For him, the dialectic wasn't a tool people use. It was the fundamental process that drives everything. History, ideas, reality, it's all unfolding through this constant, dynamic push and pull of opposing forces. Now, you have probably seen this neat little three-step model before: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. You have an idea, it runs into its opposite, the two clash, and out of that conflict comes a new, more advanced idea, which then becomes the next thesis, and the cycle just keeps on going. It's a clean, simple way to picture it. But here's a fun fact, a little correction to the history books. Hegel himself never actually used those three famous words. His own terms were more like abstract, negative, and concrete. For him, any new abstract idea is, by its very nature, incomplete. It has to go through its own internal contradiction, what he called the negative, to become fully formed or concrete. The conflict wasn't something external attacking the idea. It was a necessary part of its own growth. And to really get his head around this incredibly complex process, Hegel used a single German word that's so packed with meaning, it's almost impossible to translate with just one English word. That word is Aufhebung. So get this, Aufhebung means to cancel something out, to abolish it, but it also means to preserve it, to lift it up to a higher level. Think about it. When two people resolve a really tough argument, their original opposing positions are canceled out, right? But the best, most valuable parts of each person's argument are preserved in the final solution. It's not destruction, it's transcendence. And Hegel had a couple of laws for how this works. One he called quantity into quality. You can add 1 degree of heat to water, then another, then another. Those are all small quantitative changes. But at 100 degrees Celsius, bam! It suddenly becomes steam, a totally different state of being. That's a qualitative leap. Another idea was the negation of the negation. This idea that history moves in spirals, not circles. We might seem to come back to old problems, but we do it with more knowledge and from a higher starting point.
Now, Hegel's massive abstract ideas about the cosmos weren't going to stay in the ivory tower for long. They were about to be brought crashing down to Earth with explosive, revolutionary force by his most famous student, Karl Marx.
Marx was totally captivated by Hegel's dialectical engine, but he thought the whole thing was running backwards. As he famously put it, Hegel's dialectic was standing on its head. It needed to be flipped right side up.
So what did he mean by that? Well, Hegel was an idealist. He believed that history was driven forward by ideas, by consciousness, by the evolution of the human spirit. Marx, on the other hand, was a materialist. He said, no, you've got it completely backwards. Our material world, our economic systems, who owns the factories, who does the work, that's what shapes our ideas, not the other way around. So Marx took the dialectic out of the philosophy department and put it right onto the factory floor. For him, the great historical conflict, the thesis versus antithesis, was the class struggle between the bourgeoisie, the owners, and the proletariat, the workers, and the final synthesis that this conflict was inevitably building toward revolution. And with that move, the dialectic was no longer just some abstract philosophical idea. It was now a potential blueprint for global revolution, making it one of the most powerful and controversial ideas in modern history. So where does all that leave us today? Well, for one thing, the idea blew up. Just look at this chart. It shows the use of the word dialectic in books, and you can see it just skyrockets from the mid-1800s onward, right after Hegel and Marx. It wasn't just for academics anymore. It was a way people were trying to understand and change the entire world. But it has always had some fierce critics. The philosopher Karl Popper launched a famous attack against it. He said, look, science makes progress by trying to disprove theories, by finding contradictions and eliminating them. Dialectic, he argued, does the exact opposite. It seems to welcome contradictions, which, in his view, was a recipe for irrationalism. And this basic disagreement created a huge split in philosophy that lasted for decades. And that brings us right back to where we started, to that provocative theory from the beginning. This more modern, critical perspective basically says the dialectic isn't a natural process we observe. It's a political tactic you employ. You create or amplify a conflict, a thesis versus an antithesis, to cause a crisis, and then you swoop in and offer your pre-planned policy as the only reasonable synthesis or solution. So what's the takeaway here? Is the dialectic some kind of profound law of the universe? A deep insight into how everything from our thoughts to our societies actually evolves? Or is it just a really compelling story, a framework we impose on the chaos of history to make sense of conflict and maybe to push for the future we want? That's the question that still hangs over this incredibly powerful and deeply puzzling idea.